Week 16 of the fantasy football season, and here's the top 36 running backs. I'm ranking this week number 1, Christian McCaffrey of the San Francisco 49ers. So it doesn't matter the matchup, obviously, for CMC. He's been the best running back easily this year. And he's just in another class of running backs. It's him and then everyone else way behind them in terms of tier of running backs. So this week, I know tougher matchup versus the Ravens, but it doesn't matter. CMC, you run him out there each and every week, and he's been a fantasy monster. Number 2, Alvin Kamara of the New Orleans Saints. Alvin Kamara, it's been a solid season for him and one of the better receiving backs out of the backfield. He's up there, obviously, with Christian McCaffrey, Rashad White, all these guys, good receiving running backs. And this week at the Rams, on Thursday Night Football, I believe Alvin Kamara will have a good ball game, and this could be a potential shootout. We usually see Thursday night ball games have high scoring. So Kamara with his catching prowess, and he's got home run ability still, even though he's been around many years now. I got him having another big game. Number 3, Kiron Williams, staying in the same game for the Los Angeles Rams. So this Rams season totally turned around since Kiron Williams returned to the lineup after he missed 4 weeks with injury. So Kiron Williams, he could do it all. In between the tackles, one of the better runners this season. Catching the football out of the backfield, he's solid. And like I said, he's opened this whole offense up for Matthew Stafford and this Ram team. So this week here versus New Orleans coming to town on Thursday night, I think Kiron Williams once again goes out there and has a nice performance. Number 4, Raheem Mostert of the Miami Dolphins. So Raheem Mostert, it's been a solid year for him, and he broke the Dolphin touchdown record. He's just a touchdown machine, is Mostert. I know the yards per game have gone down over the last few weeks, but to be honest, it doesn't matter. If he could get 40, 50 yards and find the end zone once or twice per game, that's a big fantasy day. And this week here versus the Dallas Cowboys that just got shredded by James Cook, I think Raheem Mostert goes out there once again, and this is going to be the game plan for Miami. A lot of play action, a lot of running the football, and I think Mostert has a nice ball game once again. Number 5, Rashad White of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So coming into the year, he was a fringe 4th, 5th rounder, is Rashad White. But going into next season, I imagine it'll be a late 1st, early 2nd rounder. One of the best receiving backs out of the backfield. Him and Baker Mayfield have great rapport, and he just makes plays, and pretty much every week it's at least 17 or more fantasy points. It seems like the last 2 months for Rashad White. So this week in a pretty decent matchup versus Jacksonville Jaguars, I think he goes out there once again and has a great performance. Number 6, James Cook of the Buffalo Bills. So James Cook over the last few weeks, he's jumping up the rankings very quickly for this Bill team. And this week a great matchup with the Chargers that just get shredded everywhere defensively, and they give up the 7th most fantasy points to running backs on the season. So James Cook, we know, is an explosive running back. We know he's a good receiver out of the backfield. And last week, what a performance it was for James Cook. He just went bonkers versus the Dallas Cowboys. So this week, I'm not saying he's going to go out there and have a huge performance like that. I think once again, he goes out there and has a big ball game at the Chargers, and this team's running the football more with new offensive coordinator in there. Number 7, Travis Etienne of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So Etienne, it's been a solid season for him. Some games he has those big games, and some games it's a mid-type of game, but for the most part, it's 12 or more fantasy points minimum for Travis Etienne. A good receiver out of the backfield, no doubt about it. We don't know Trevor Lawrence for sure, if it's going to be him or Beathard, considering the concussion he had in last week's game. But either way, Etienne gets a good workload, and no one's really a threat to him over there, where many people thought coming into the year Tank Bigsby would have, but it hasn't been the case. Number 8, Jahmyr Gibbs of the Detroit Lions. So Jahmyr Gibbs, I know he's had some monster games this year and some games where it was a pedestrian 8-9 fantasy points, but this week indoors once again at Minnesota, a run defense that isn't all that great. I think Jahmyr Gibbs has that home run ability. He's a big-time type of player. Another guy like Rashad White, 1st, 2nd round, most likely next season. We're going to see Jahmyr Gibbs goes in fantasy drafts. And this week in Minnesota, I think he goes out there and has a nice game. Number 9, Breece Hall of the New York Jets. I know Breece Hall might be a little high on this list here, but Breece Hall's a good running back. Great matchup versus the Commanders, one of the worst defenses in the league, obviously. And we saw last week Kiron Williams go over 150 yards rushing versus Commander defense. I know this Jet team, it's been a mess all year, offensive line, quarterback situation, but Breece Hall's a playmaker, and he's overcome a lot of times bad quarterback play and bad O-line play. So this week versus Washington, people might think he's high up there on the list, but just going off matchup and playmaking ability, plus he's due, I think he has a good ball game. Number 10, Jonathan Taylor of the Indianapolis Colts. I believe Taylor will return in this game, even though I did think last week Jonathan Taylor was returning to the lineup. But this week, a good matchup with the Atlanta Falcons. This Colt team playing great football, no doubt about it. And if you could add Jonathan Taylor to that lineup towards the end of the season here, where they're making the playoff push, I think he could pay big dividends for fantasy owners. And obviously this Indianapolis Colts team. So Taylor, if he's back, I assume he's going to get a big workload right away. We saw Zach Morris go down with an arm injury. We don't know if he's going to play in this game. And if Taylor plays, he's a top 10 running back. If not, Zach Morris, whoever, those guys are the lower tier type RBs. Number 11, Saquon Barkley of the New York Giants. So Philadelphia, they've lost 3 ball games in a row now, and they were on the ropes a little bit. So Saquon Barkley last week, I know he didn't have a good game at all at the New Orleans Saints. I know Philly's a very tough matchup, giving up the second least amount of fantasy points to running backs on the season. But, it's a division ball game and anything goes. And this Giant team, they're going to want to play spoiler versus the Eagles, I believe. So Saquon Barkley, he gets that big workload, 85-90% of the touches for this New York Giant team. And this week at Philadelphia, I think he bounces back. You rarely see Barkley have 2 bad games in a row. Number 12, Tony Pollard of the Dallas Cowboys. So Tony Pollard, it's been an up and down season for him. And obviously coming off a bad ankle injury, held him back a little bit early in the year. But he's starting to look quicker as Pollard. He's starting to break tackles. And this week in Miami, this Cowboy team, I think they got to come out and run the football a little bit more. I know versus Buffalo, they threw the football a little bit too much. So right now, Tony Pollard, this week, I think, goes out there and has a good ball game. Team Derrick Henry of Tennessee Titans. So Derrick Henry last week, one of the worst games of his career, if not the worst game. Only 16 carries, 9 yards in that one. So he got bottled up. But Derrick Henry, just like I mentioned with Barkley, it's rare to see Henry have 2 bad games in a row. I know he's behind a bad offensive line over there in Tennessee, but the Seattle Seahawks D-line isn't all that great. I thought the Philadelphia Eagles ran the football pretty effectively. So Derrick Henry, after a bad game, I think he's going to go out there and have a big game. I know it might not be a Will Levis starting that. It might go back to Ryan Tannehill or Malik Willis. But anyway, Derrick Henry's a power back. It just takes a couple goal line stoppers and 60, 70 yards for him to have a big ball game. And it's definitely a possibility this week versus the Seahawks. 14, Joe Mixon of the Cincinnati Bengals. So Joe Mixon, he's been getting a solid workload, especially more work since Joe Burrow's been out. And it's been working for this Cincinnati Bengal team. They've won 3 games in a row. Jake Browning, he's one of the better backup quarterbacks in the league, playing good. And Joe Mixon's in stride as well and making plays and putting up fantasy points. So this week, I know a little bit of a tougher matchup at the Pittsburgh Steelers. But we saw guys like Ty Goodson and Trey Sermon run well versus Steelers defense last week. So I think Joe Mixon goes out there and has a good game, and he's a solid number 2 back for fantasy owners this week. 15, DeAndre Swift of the Philadelphia Eagles. So DeAndre Swift, he had a few bad games in a row, but on Monday night versus the Seahawks, I thought he ran the football well. I know with that tush push, it takes a lot of points off the board for DeAndre Swift, where already Jalen Hurts this season has 9 rushing touchdowns, and most of them are coming off, obviously, that tush push. Swift's an explosive running back. This Giant team, they're not good versus the run for the most part this season, and I think Swift, even though Kenneth Gainwell got a decent workload last week, so solid 2 back as well. 16, Isaiah Pacheco of the Kansas City Chiefs. So he missed the last 2 games with shoulder injury, but Pacheco, we know, is a tough running back. He's going to be back in the lineup, and this is a game that this Chief team's got to win as well. I know they won last week, and I know it's a pretty good matchup for them this week versus the Vegas Raiders, but this Raider team just came off scoring 63 points. So this Chief team wants everyone in the lineup, and Isaiah Pacheco, we know, one of the more physical backs in the league, and he runs for every yard, and he runs the defenders over. So this week versus Vegas, I think he goes out there once again and has a good performance. 17, Kenneth Walker of the Seattle Seahawks. So Kenneth Walker, he was on the downslide a little bit, but the last game versus the Eagles, he went out there versus one of the best defensive lines in the league, and he ran it right at him. I know later in that game they've shut him down, but he went over 100 yards to Walker. The explosiveness looked back, and I liked Walker a lot this season, but I know with Zach Charbonnet and the injury held them back a little bit the last 4 or 5 weeks. But this week in a good matchup at the Tennessee Titans that get shredded on the ground a lot this season. I like him as a number 2 back. 18, James Conner of the Arizona Cardinals. Said James Conner, we know, is a physical running back. We know he's had a lot of injury concerns throughout his career, but the last 2 weeks versus the Steelers, 14, and then week 15, a solid ball game in a tough matchup versus the 49ers. So this week, a great matchup with the Chicago Bears. A DST that really don't stop anyone. And James Conner, he's getting majority of the work. I know DiMercito had a decent amount of work last week as well in the passing game, but that was mostly garbage time. So James Conner, as long as he's getting that workload, 70-80% of the touches, and it's going to be a close game, I believe, between the Cardinals and the Bears, 2 similar teams. I think he's a solid back. Number 19, Austin Ekeler of the Los Angeles Chargers. So Austin Ekeler, one of the biggest busts in fantasy football, no doubt about it, this season here for this Los Angeles Charger team. So Ekeler, He's a running back that's losing work weekly. Isaiah Spiller, Joshua Kelly taking work from him. And this week, a very tough matchup versus the Buffalo Bills. But it's tough if you don't have better options than Austin Ekeler to sit him out of your lineup. So right now, he's pretty much a borderline 2 or flex option in a tough matchup. And he's got a bad offense with Easton Stick over their quarterback. Number 20, Josh Jacobs of the Las Vegas Raiders. Zamir Whitey filled in well for Jacobs in that 63-21 monster victory, this Raider team versus the Los Angeles Chargers. So this week, a tougher matchup at the Kansas City Chiefs. I believe Josh Jacobs will be back in the lineup. They gave him that extra 11 days of rest with this ball game being one of the 3 Monday night games. So Josh Jacobs, a physical back. Last season, one of the best running backs in fantasy football. And this week, we'll see if he can get on the field and have a good matchup. If not, Zamir White, he would be a running back lower down in the rankings, anywhere from that 28 to 36 range. 21, Aaron Jones of the Green Bay Packers. Aaron Jones finally returned, and he looked healthy in that game last week for the Packers, and a bad loss versus the Bucks. But this week, a great matchup at the Panthers. Give up the 3rd most fantasy points to running backs on the season. And even if A.J. Dillon returns off the thumb injury, I think Aaron Jones is still going to get 70-80% of the work. And we know he's a better receiving back out of the backfield as well than Dillon. 22, Ezekiel Elliott of the New England Patriots. So this is a Sunday night football game. There's a possibility Ramondre Stevenson returns. But to be honest, this Patriot team at this time of the year, they should just save some of their up-and-coming guys like Stevenson or whoever on the defensive side is well banged up and save them for next season, because there's really no reason to go out there and get one of these guys injured. So Ezekiel Elliott, he's had a solid season, I believe, for this New England Patriot team. And this week, a pretty good matchup at the Denver Broncos that give up the 2nd most fantasy points to running backs on the season. So Zeke's been a better receiver out of the backfield than previous seasons with the Dallas Cowboys, and he's still got that burst and physicality in the run game. So this week, he's going to work his way into volume 2. Running back numbers, I believe 23, Bijan Robinson of the Atlanta Falcons. I know Bijan Robinson, he's way down here on my list, but this guy, he was a 1st-round pick in many fantasy drafts, and he totally busted out for the most part as Bijan. We saw flashes, but it's been the coaching staff, and just when you got bad quarterback play, it's not going to help the running game, obviously, where teams have dared all season Desmond Ridder to beat him. So this week, a middle-of-the-pack matchup with the Indianapolis Colts coming to town. Bijan Robinson, to me, is more of a flex option or borderline number 2 running back, because you just don't know, like I mentioned, where you're going to get from Bijan Robinson. 24, Devon Achane of the Miami Dolphins. Devon Achane, one of the more explosive running backs we've seen coming into the league in terms of speed and just that home run ability. Last week, I know he had a pedestrian type of game for his standards. Only 9.20 fantasy points in PPR leagues. But this week, a good matchup versus the Cowboys that we just saw got shredded by the Buffalo Bills on the ground, over 200 yards. And that's the blueprint to beat this Dallas team. So I think we're going to see a lot of Achane, obviously, and Raheem Mostert. 25, Brian Robinson of the Washington Commanders. So Robinson, we know he's banged up with the hamstring injury, and he missed last week's game after coming off a bye, which obviously isn't a good sign. But if he does play in this game, it's a solid matchup, believe it or not, at the New York Jets. I give up top 10 numbers to running backs on the season. So Robinson, a physical running back. He's actually improved in the passing game as well over the last few weeks. So if he's back in the lineup, we know he's the workhorse over there with really no competition. Antonio Gibson, more the passing downs back. Number 26, David Montgomery of the Detroit Lions. And Montgomery a little down on my list here this week, because obviously every team is playing. And Montgomery, for the most part, it's just tough to touch share over there with the Lions backfield. So Montgomery, for the most part, you know he's going to get the short yardage work. Minnesota Vikings, their defense is a middle-of-the-pack type of D. Even though they've given up some big games on the ground this season, believe it or not, they give up the 3rd least amount of fantasy points to backs on the year. So Montgomery, if he's not scoring a touchdown, really, though, he's not doing much in the passing game, obviously, and he's more of a pedestrian back at that point. 27, Javonte Williams of the Denver Broncos. So Javonte Williams, it's been a solid season, I believe, for him. I know some games he really hasn't done much, and they're using 3 backs over there in Denver at times with P. Ryan and Jaleel McLaughlin. And this week, it's a middle-of-the-pack matchup versus New England. But this obviously could be a game where Denver's up early and often, and that's where you run the football a lot, to run the clock out and just wear down defenses. When Denver's playing with a lead or in a close game, Javonte Williams' numbers are better. But if they're trailing in ball games or whatever the case like that, then they got to abandon the run, and he's not really a receiver out of the backfield. 28, Jerome Ford of the Cleveland Browns. Jerome Ford's been a solid running back all season, filling in for for Nick Chubb, a good receiver out of the backfield. He's got home run ability as well, where he could take it anywhere on the field to the house. We've seen it this year. And this week, a good matchup at the Houston Texans, where their DST really hasn't been good all season versus the run as well, besides last week where they shut down Derrick Henry. But every other time, running backs have had good ball games versus them. So I think this week, once again, Ford's a decent flex option. Borderline two-back, 29, Ty Chandler of the Minnesota Vikings. So Chandler, in my opinion, deserves more work for this Minnesota Viking team, where he's a running back that's explosive. He's a better receiver out of the backfield than Alexander Madison. And obviously this Viking team hasn't believed in Madison all season, where they brought in Cam Akers early in the year as well in a deal before he went down. So right now, if Chandler gets opportunity once again, which he should, after coming off 130 yards on the ground, he's definitely a solid back this week, even in a little bit of a tougher matchup. Number 30, Jalen Warren of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So Jalen Warren, we know he's an explosive back, but this Steelers team as a whole, it's just been tough all season to trust many guys on this offense to go out there weekly and put up consistent fantasy points. So this week in a tough division matchup versus the Bengals, where their defense has improved a little bit over the last few weeks, where their defense is beatable in the running game. We saw Chandler last week have a big game on the ground. I just don't know if Jalen Warren could go out there and have a big game with a poor offensive line, and that with Mason Rudolph at quarterback, where they're going to dare them Cincinnati for Rudolph to beat them instead of the running game. 31, Devin Singletary of the Houston Texans. So Singletary, it's been a weird type of year. There's some games he explodes like he did last week, over 100 yards, where we've seen that a few times this season from him. And then games where he's not doing much, and Pierce and him a 50-50 split. But this week versus Cleveland, tough matchup. One of the best defenses in the league, obviously, here. And I think with C.J. Stroud back in the lineup, possibly coming off the concussion, they're going to run the football less, which makes sense for this Houston Texan team. So obviously, if Stroud is out, they're going to run more. If not, they're going to pass more. So Singletary, another running back regardless, in my opinion. That fringe flex option to number 2 back, 32, Gus Edwards of the Baltimore Ravens. So Gus Edwards now, he's going to get a little bit more of work, even though Justice Hill is there as well in this Baltimore backfield, because now Keaton Mitchell out for the season, unfortunately, tearing the ACL, where he just was running and he got caught in the turf and that knee just buckled and it went on him. But this week, a tough matchup at San Francisco. Gus Edwards, we know, obviously he's a touchdown and bust type of fantasy player. We've seen it all season. If he's not finding the end zone, he's pretty much topped out 6-7 fantasy points. Is this week in a tough matchup at Frisco, he's not really a back I'm interested in. 33, Trb Hubbert of the Carolina Panthers. So the last few weeks, he's definitely getting bigger workloads in this backfield here for this Carolina Panther team. After they got rid of the whole coaching staff, and Trb Hubbert really getting a lot of touches, 20-plus touches over the last 2 weeks. I know it hasn't been that great yards per carry for Trb Hubbert, but we know he's a decent receiver out of the backfield. We know he could run in between the tackles. And Miles Sanders really hasn't been a threat to him in the backfield. So right now, this week, with a decent matchup versus the Green Bay Packers that give up the 9th most fantasy points to running backs on the season, I think Trb Hubbert could go out there and have a decent ball game. I'm not saying it's going to be a big performance, but as a low-end 2 flex option, I still think 11, 13 fantasy points in PPR leagues is definitely a possibility. 34, Najee Harris of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And Najee Harris, we know it's been an up and down year for Harris. There's some great games we've seen out of him this season, and some games where he hasn't shown up at all. In the last few weeks, he's failed to reach double-digit fantasy points 3 weeks in a row. So I've said it all season with Najee Harris, Jalen Warren's been the better back, more explosive back, obviously a better receiver out of the backfield as well. And Harris, I know he's only been in the league a few seasons, but right now the speed's gone down, and just even breaking tackles and making big plays have gone down. So he's nothing more than a flex option, in my opinion. 35, Roschon Johnson of the Chicago Bears. So this Bear backfield's been a mess now, with Herbert, Foreman, and Johnson all getting work, and none of these guys really emerging and putting up fantasy points. But the reason I think Johnson's the favorite to have the better fantasy day out of all those guys, because he's a good running back out of the backfield catching it. We know he's got explosive speed as well. And this Bear team, they got 3 backs, and I think they got to find one and go with the hot hand. And that's what they did towards the end of the game last week with Johnson. So this week in a good matchup versus Arizona that gives up top 5 fantasy points to running backs on the season, I think Johnson, if you're in a pinch, could be a decent option, even though I'm not counting on him. Hopefully you have better options than Johnson to run out there. And the final running back I'm ranking this week's Tajay Spears of the Tennessee Titans. If the Titans are trailing early and often in this game, you know, Tajay Spears is the passing downs back. He's an explosive running back, and he's got good hands as well. out of the backfield. So we saw Derrick Henry last week not do much, but that was a game where they were leading most of the game as Tennessee and blew it towards the end. So right now, Tajay Spears, he's an explosive back. There's games this season where he's outsnapped Derrick Henry, but right now he's nothing more desperation flex option in deeper leagues here, especially in the playoffs. That's top 36 running backs I'm ranking for Week 16 of the fantasy football season.